The midday sun beat down like a spotlight from the heavens, harsh and unrelenting. The lake shimmered in the distance, a mirror of blue broken only by ripples from the occasional boat drifting lazily across the surface. Pines lined the far shore, tall and still, like sentinels keeping watch over the quiet beauty of it all. It was the kind of day you remember in winter, the warmth on your skin, the scent of sun-baked earth, the soft hum of cicadas vibrating in the background like a lullaby for the land. And me? I was just standing there, keys in hand, staring at the weathered wooden sign that read Lakeview Office, Private. My office. My dream. Finally real. I had bought the property just 2 weeks earlier, closed all the paperwork, and done the back-and-forth shuffle with the county clerk. The building was modest, a converted lake ranger's cabin with a small deck overlooking the water. Not flashy but perfect. I planned to use it as a workspace, an escape from the city chaos where I could think, write, and breathe. That was supposed to be day one. A soft start. Just me, the lake, and maybe some fresh paint. But then she came. I didn't hear her approach. 1 second I was locking up my car, the next I felt that eerie sensation, like someone watching you from just a little too close. I turned and there she was. Mid-50s, tennis skirt, cell phone in a floral print case already raised to chest level like a weapon. Her sunglasses were huge and mirrored, which made it impossible to read her expression, but her body language screamed entitlement. She was a caricature I'd seen in memes and HOA horror stories, but real and standing 10 feet from me like she owned the very ground. "You can't park here," she said without so much as a hello. Her voice had that fake sweetness like iced tea made with salt. I blinked. I'm the owner," I replied, friendly but confused. She tilted her head slightly. "Of what exactly?" "This building," I said, gesturing behind me. "Just bought it. Got the deed yesterday." Now, you'd think this would have been the part where a normal person might soften, maybe ask a few questions or even, God forbid, welcome me to the community. Not her. Her eyes narrowed, or at least I think they did, hard to tell through those damn sunglasses. She didn't ask for proof. Didn't even say anything to me. Just turned slightly, pulled her phone up, and started dialing. "You're trespassing on HOA property," she announced, loud enough for the squirrels to hear. "I'm calling the sheriff." I laughed. I couldn't help it, it was just too absurd. "You're serious?" I asked. "I own this lot." But she wasn't laughing. She wasn't even pretending to listen. She had one finger in her ear and was already speaking into the phone in that classic, performative panic. "Yes, hi, there's a suspicious man down by the lake office. He says he owns it but I've never seen him before. He's refusing to leave." Suspicious man. Just like that. I went from new property owner to possible threat in under 30 seconds. I opened my glove box, pulled out the folder with the deed and walked a few steps closer, but not too close. She jerked back like I was holding a weapon. I said, "Look, you don't need to call anyone, I have the paperwork right here." But she was already finishing her call, smug now. "They're sending someone." I just stood there stunned. It was a bizarre feeling, being confident in your truth but still rattled. Like trying to argue with someone in a dream where the logic doesn't work and nothing you say seems to matter. About 15 minutes later, a sheriff's vehicle rolled up, slow and deliberate, gravel crunching under the tires. The deputy stepped out, tall, broad, with mirrored aviators that somehow seemed less ridiculous than hers. He gave her a nod, clearly familiar, but when she launched into her version of events, he held up a hand and said, "Let me talk to him first." I handed over my documents, explaining the whole situation. He took maybe 30 seconds to read the deed, looked up at the building, then back to me. His lips twitched like he was holding back a laugh. Then came the moment I'll never forget. He turned slowly toward her, took off his sunglasses and said, flat as a rock skipping across the lake, "Ma'am, he owns it." Silence. She stood frozen. No words, no backpedal, just tight lips and a twitch in her left eye. I didn't, there must be some mistake," she finally mumbled, but the air had gone out of her completely. She was shrinking by the second, her authority evaporating under the heat of the truth. "I didn't say anything. I didn't need to." The sheriff nodded, handed me back my papers and said, "Enjoy the view. Let us know if you have any issues." As he turned to leave, she was still standing there, rooted like a statue in the hot July sun. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just that hollow glare, trying to process the fact that, for once, her badge of HOA power hadn't worked. And me? I turned back toward the lake, heart pounding with a strange mix of disbelief and satisfaction. I'd only just arrived. But already, I knew this wasn't going to be the quiet getaway I had imagined. To understand why that encounter rattled me so much, and why it mattered, you have to know who we're dealing with. First there's me. 42 years old, recently semi-retired after selling my small logistics business. After 2 decades of stress, sleepless nights, and growing a company from a laptop on a folding table to 35 employees and 2 warehouses, I finally gave myself permission to breathe. No more email at midnight. No more Monday panic. I cashed out, paid off debt, and looked for a place where I could slow down, reflect, maybe write that book I kept saying I'd write. That's how I found the lake. Lake Elmside wasn't just beautiful, it was quiet, like it had secrets it was willing to share if you just sat still long enough. The kind of place where the loudest thing you hear at night is crickets or distant frogs. And nestled along the shore was an old ranger's office, and used for years, listed off-market by a retiring county worker who said, "You'd be doing us a favor taking it." It was technically outside the official residential development, but within view of the main HOA subdivision, Lake Elmside Shores. That's where she lives. Her real name is Barbara, but even she introduces herself as Barb from the board, which tells you a lot. Early 60s, silver blonde bob, lips always pursed like she just tasted something sour. She wears polo shirts with HOA committee stitched above her heart and seems to treat the neighborhood like it's her kingdom, and she's the self-appointed queen. Everyone calls her Karen behind her back, some even to her face now. Barb has lived in Lake Elmside Shores for 20 years and runs the HOA with the efficiency of a dictator and the passive aggressiveness of a seasoned suburban general. Mailbox 3 inches too tall? You'll get a letter. Leaves in your gutter? Expect a photo taped to your door. Her favorite phrase, used often proudly, is, "That's not in compliance." I didn't even live in the HOA. My office property was technically part of the original county jurisdiction, a sort of outlier that existed before the HOA was established. But that didn't stop Barb from believing it fell under her sacred domain. The building had been unoccupied for years and she probably got used to thinking of it as hers, or at least part of the HOA's extended turf. Maybe she held meetings there once. Maybe she dreamed of turning it into a Lakeview Welcome Center, or a craft room, or whatever middle-aged tyrants fantasize about when they get bored with retirement and decide to wage war on peace and quiet. There are others on the HOA board, of course, but Barb runs it like her own fiefdom. Rumor has it, the others mostly rubber stamp her policies just to avoid the endless email chains and back-to-back complaints. One neighbor told me, she once filed a violation report because someone had a pumpkin on their porch in February. And yes, she included photos. The residents themselves? Mostly good folks. Retirees, quiet couples, weekenders. A few families with kids who ride bikes in perfect little loops through the cul-de-sacs. One guy, Rick, 2 doors down from Barb, once whispered to me, "If you can avoid her for a week, you've won." He gave me a beer and a look that said Godspeed. But that lake office, my office, it mattered to me in ways no one else would ever fully understand. It wasn't just a place to escape, it was a symbol. Of freedom. Of years of sacrifice paying off. Of owning something that belonged to me and no one else. That tiny wood-paneled building represented everything I'd worked for and everything I wanted to protect. And in one afternoon, I realized Barb didn't care about any of that. To her, I was a disruption to her domain. A wild card she hadn't anticipated. Someone who didn't ask permission to exist near her kingdom, and worse, someone she couldn't control. That made me dangerous in her eyes. Or at least, inconvenient. I thought at first that she was just having a bad day. That maybe it was a misunderstanding. That after seeing the deed she'd apologize, maybe even laugh about the mix-up. But no. What I saw in her eyes, beneath the sunglasses, in the curl of her lip, the stiffness in her posture, wasn't confusion. It was challenge. She wasn't protecting the neighborhood. She was protecting her power. The idea that she could bark orders and people would jump. That her presence was law. And when the sheriff sided with me, she didn't just lose an argument, she lost her illusion of control. That's why she froze. That's why she never apologized. And I knew in that moment, this wasn't over. Barb was the kind of person who needed to win. Who would keep pushing, poking, searching for a rule, real or imagined, to reassert her dominance. And the worst part? She had a whole HOA manual to weaponize. All I had was truth, and a little office by the lake. But that was going to be enough. It didn't take long after the sheriff's visit for the real battle to begin. 3 days to be exact. I was still settling into the space, patching up some dry rot on the trim, swapping out the old blinds, and enjoying the morning breeze with a cup of coffee on the deck. It was peaceful. So, birds chirped in the trees. Dragonflies hovered like little helicopters above the waterline. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Then came the envelope. No return address. Just a crisp white envelope taped to my office door like some kind of summons. Inside, a printed letter on Lake Elmside Shores HOA letterhead, complete with their smug little pine tree logo in the top left corner. It began, "To whom it may concern," which already told me they hadn't done their homework, or worse, they had and were pretending I didn't exist. Read. This property has been identified as falling within the Greater Elmside Environmental Protection Zone. As such, all usage of the structure must comply with HOA-established zoning standards and visual harmony guidelines. Current modifications, e.g. repainting, trimming of lakeside foliage, exterior storage containers, appear to be out of compliance. Please contact the HOA Architectural Committee within 5 business days to avoid escalation. I stared at it for a good minute, blinking like I was trying to reset reality. Environmental Protection Zone? Visual harmony? What did that even mean? I wasn't building a Walmart. I was touching up the faded green paint that had peeled off in strips during the last decade. And this storage container they were so worried about? That was a Rubbermaid bin with paint rollers in it. At first I laughed again. Thought maybe it was Barb lashing out after the embarrassment with the sheriff. A petty swipe at my freedom. But something about the tone of the letter, so formal, so rehearsed, suggested this was just the opening shot in a longer campaign. I did what any rational person would do. I called the number on the letter. A man answered, Roger, the HOA secretary. Nervous energy. Voice like someone constantly apologizing even when they're not sure for what. I explained who I was, that I wasn't part of the HOA, and that the property wasn't under their jurisdiction. He hesitated. Well, yes and no, he said, fumbling. You're technically outside the primary residential boundary, but the association guidelines apply to all structures visible from community paths. Visible from community paths. So if you can see my office from your neighborhood, I have to follow your rules? I asked, incredulous. That's generally how we interpret it, he replied, with the tone of a man reciting something he'd heard but didn't quite believe himself. The conversation ended with Roger promising to bring it up at the next board meeting. I thanked him, hung up, and spent a long moment just staring out at the lake. That calm I had felt, the serenity of starting fresh, was unraveling. The next morning another letter. This time slipped under my door. Second notice. Unauthorized exterior activity has been documented. Continued violations will result in fines of up to $250 per incident. Your cooperation is appreciated. No name. No signature. Just intimidation by committee. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about the office. This was about control. Barb couldn't stand that there was a piece of land near her kingdom that didn't bow to her authority. So, if she couldn't enforce it through rules, she'd do it through pressure, through technicalities and invented guidelines and repetition until the resistance wore me down. But I wasn't going anywhere. Still, I couldn't lie, I felt cornered. It's one thing to be in the right, to have a deed in your hand and the law behind you. It's another to wake up wondering if today's the day someone leaves another threat on your property, or files a bogus complaint with the county, or shows up unannounced with a clipboard and a smug smile. I started to feel uneasy, even angry. This was supposed to be my retreat. My peace. But now it felt like I was living under surveillance, constantly anticipating the next act of petty warfare. The breeze didn't feel as fresh. The silence started to feel heavy. Even the sunset seemed tinged with anxiety. And somewhere deep in my gut I realized something chilling. Barb had done this before. Maybe not exactly like this, maybe not with sheriffs and fake zoning notices, but I could tell, this was a game she knew how to play. A war of attrition. Slowly isolate, confuse, frustrate. Bury you in rules and letters and implication until you gave up out of sheer exhaustion. She thought I'd fold. She thought I'd pack up and leave. Sell the place back to the HOA maybe, or stop coming altogether. But what she didn't know, what she hadn't factored in, was that I'd built my life clawing through red tape and bureaucratic garbage. I didn't get to peace by avoiding conflict. I got there by surviving it. And this little war? This power trip dressed up in official language and pine tree logos? This was personal now. The third letter came hand-delivered. Not mailed, not taped, handed to me mid-sip of my morning coffee, by a man in a polo shirt so tight across his chest I could practically see his heartbeat. His name was Dale. He introduced himself as Vice President of the HOA Architectural Committee, said it like I was supposed to salute. He didn't smile, didn't even look at me properly. Just thrust the envelope forward with the stiffness of someone who thought this counted as public service. Thought it'd be best to bring this to you directly, he said. How thoughtful, I replied, taking the envelope. He lingered. Anything else? I asked. You may want to review section 4.2 on exterior fixtures, he said, squinting toward the building like he'd spotted a war crime. I waited until he walked back to his golf cart. Yes, a literal HOA golf cart with a sticker on the side, before opening the letter. This one wasn't a warning. It was a fine. A formal HOA citation in the amount of $125 for unauthorized structural alteration. The alteration? I had replaced the rusted hinges on the lake office's back door. Hinges. Purchased from the local hardware store, installed by me because the old ones had corroded so badly that the door practically screamed when it opened. The fine had a due date. A method of payment. A small print clause at the bottom. Continued refusal to comply may result in legal escalation. That was the moment it stopped being annoying. That's when I got angry. I immediately emailed the HOA using the contact on their official site. I attached a copy of my deed. I explained in detail that my property was not part of the HOA. I cited parcel maps, county boundary records, and even dug up a land survey showing the office's separation from the official Lake Elmside Shores development. No response. 3 days passed. Then came a new fine, this time for $200. Unauthorized vegetation trimming. Apparently, cutting back the blackberry bramble that was overtaking my porch was now grounds for punishment. They included blurry photos clearly taken from a distance with a phone camera. One was even time-stamped at 6:13 a.m., meaning someone had been lurking around my office at dawn, trying to catch me in the act of lawn maintenance. I tried again. Sent another email. No reply. Then the emails started coming to me, not from a board address but from Barb's personal account. She didn't even hide it. The subject line of the first email was, "Clarification needed regarding your activities at the lake office." She wrote, "Mr. Jacobs, as a courtesy, I'd like to remind you that all properties within visual proximity to Elmside Shores are subject to our neighborhood cohesion standards. Several residents have voiced concerns about recent changes to the exterior of your structure. It is imperative that you respond to these notices to avoid further escalation. Warmly, Barbara, HOA Board President." I didn't reply. At this point, it was clear logic wasn't going to get me anywhere. But Barb wasn't done. A week later, I came out of the office one morning to find 2 orange cones placed at the edge of my driveway. Not county cones. These were custom labeled with alias property zone and no access. They weren't blocking anything. Just sitting there. A territorial marking. The HOA version of pissing on a tree. I kicked them into the ditch. That same afternoon, I was in my office working when I heard voices outside. I peeked out the blinds. 2 board members, I recognized one from the HOA website, walking slowly along the road, talking and pointing. One of them had a clipboard. The other had a tape measure. I walked out to meet them. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" They looked startled, like raccoons caught raiding a cooler. "Oh, we're just taking some measurements for a new shoreline visibility survey," one said. "On private property?" I asked. No, we're just staying on the easement." They weren't. I knew exactly where the county easement ended. They were 2 feet over the line into my gravel. I told them politely to leave and they did, but not before one of them muttered, "He's gonna be a problem." They weren't wrong. I was becoming a problem, at least to them. I wasn't folding. I wasn't backing off. But still, the pressure mounted. The next week, I got a letter from a local law office. Not a real lawsuit, just a legal-sounding notice of intent to begin proceedings for non-compliance with HOA standards. It had no legal weight, but it was meant to scare me. To drain me. To make me second-guess whether the fight was worth it. And for a moment, I'll admit it, I felt worn out. I was tired of playing defense. Tired of walking out each morning wondering what new nonsense they'd come up with. I didn't buy that lake office to get into a war with retirees and windbreakers. I just wanted peace. But if they were going to turn this into a war, then I'd stop reacting. And I'd start planning. I always believe there are 2 kinds of battles. The ones you win with brute force and the ones you win by knowing the rules better than the person trying to use them against you. This wasn't about a physical fight. This was about manipulation, authority, and perception. Barb and her HOA lapdogs weren't just trying to enforce rules, they were trying to create a reality where their rules applied, whether they actually did or not. The day I got the phony intent to sue letter, I sat down with a yellow legal pad and started making a list. Not of what they'd done, but of what they'd assumed I wouldn't do. That was their weak point. Barb's whole strategy depended on the idea that I'd be too overwhelmed, too annoyed, or too passive to push back in the right way. She counted on people quitting, not fighting. That's where she miscalculated. The first step was information. If they wanted to use bureaucracy as a weapon, I'd turn it into a shield. I requested copies of every HOA map, bylaw, meeting minute and annexation record available through the county. Most of it was online. Some I had to drive into town and get in person. I spent a week knee-deep in documents and zoning maps, highlighting boundaries, easement lines, and jurisdictional notes so obscure they looked like legal hieroglyphics. And right there, buried in a 2006 zoning resolution, was the nail in the coffin. Lake Elmside Shores had, in fact, attempted to extend their HOA boundary in 2005, to include the lakefront zone where my office sat. But the vote failed. Only 61% of residents had approved the expansion, short of the two-thirds majority required under state HOA code. It was recorded in a footnote. Almost invisible, but official. My property had been explicitly excluded. Which meant, no HOA rights, no visibility clause, no fines, no inspections, and no legal claim. I had the proof. The next part was making sure they knew I had it, and that I wasn't going to keep this quiet. I drafted my own letter. But I didn't send it to Barb. I sent it to everyone else. Every board member. Every HOA resident whose email I could find. I even left a few printed copies in the neighborhood mailbox hut, tucked neatly into the HOA newsletter rack. The letter was concise, factual, and as dry as their bylaws. Dear residents of Lake Elmside Shores, I am writing to inform you that recent attempts by the HOA board to enforce jurisdiction over my property are in direct contradiction with the 2006 county zoning resolution. File #Z06-128. Said resolution clearly indicates that the proposed boundary extension to include Lakeside Parcel 7B, my property, failed to pass with the required two-thirds majority. Therefore, all HOA activity directed toward my property is not only unenforceable, it is legally invalid. Any future attempts to issue fines, letters, or make unauthorized entries onto my land will be documented and reported to the county authorities as harassment. I've also spoken with a local real estate attorney who has agreed to provide pro bono guidance should this behavior continue. Respectfully, Daniel Jacobs, owner, Parcel 7B. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten a lawsuit. I didn't write in all caps. I just laid out the truth. Within 2 days, I received exactly 0 responses from the board. Not even Barb. But the energy in the neighborhood shifted. The golf cart patrol stopped. The 6 a.m. stalker photos ceased. The cones didn't come back. The fines? Never mentioned again. But I wasn't done. I filed a formal complaint with the County Code Enforcement Office, citing HOA harassment outside jurisdiction. I also sent a copy of the zoning map and vote results to the sheriff's office, just in case Barb decided to start dialing 911 again. Then, for good measure, I started renovating the office in plain sight. I painted the deck bright cedar red. I installed solar path lights. I even added a metal garden sculpture shaped like a heron, just because I knew it would drive her nuts. The final touch. A small wooden sign by the road. Private property. Not affiliated with Elmside Shores HOA. Have a peaceful day, smiley face. It was subtle, polite, but very clear. I knew Barb saw it. A week later, I caught a glimpse of her walking her dog down the trail and stopping at the property line. She stood there for a long time, arms folded, lips pressed so tightly they disappeared into her face. She didn't step over the line. She didn't say a word. And in that moment, I realized something more satisfying than revenge. I'd won without becoming her. I hadn't screamed, slandered, or stooped to pettiness. I'd simply used her favorite tools, documents, rules, order, better than she could. And now she was the one watching, powerless to interfere, as my deck glowed in the sunset and dragonflies danced above the water she no longer controlled. By the time spring rolled around, my lake office wasn't just a private retreat anymore. It was a symbol. Not just to me but to the neighborhood. A kind of quiet rebellion. People started noticing. A few neighbors even walked by, smiled, waved. One guy, James from Lot 17, gave me a thumbs up and muttered, "Glad somebody finally stood up to her." Barb must have felt it too. That shift. That slippage of control. She wasn't used to losing. Certainly not in public and definitely not permanently. And this wasn't just a loss. This was a crack in her carefully manufactured image of authority, one that had been reinforced over years of unanswered letters, unchecked fines, and passive-aggressive newsletters. And worst of all, I hadn't just ignored her. I had outplayed her. The final nail came on a Friday morning, about a month after I posted my zoning letter to the community. I had just finished installing a new sliding glass door that opened directly onto the lake. Sunlight poured in like liquid gold. I was wiping the glass down when I noticed a car pulling up, different from the usual parade of HOA golf carts and garden-stickered sedans. It was a silver Lexus. Clean, polished, city plates. A woman stepped out, late 30s, crisp blazer, heels clicking against the gravel as she made her way up the walk. I met her on the porch, paint-speckled shirt and all. "Mr. Jacobs?" she asked. "That's me." She handed me a folder and a card. Her name was Lauren Wexler, County Zoning and Land Management Liaison. Turns out she'd received my complaint against the HOA and decided to follow up in person. Not just because of the jurisdictional overreach, but because she'd already received 3 other complaints from residents claiming the board had issued baseless citations for things like aggressive wind chimes and inappropriate solar garden decor. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said, sitting across from me at the picnic table. "But it looks like you triggered something bigger than you realized." I wasn't surprised. Barb had built her power not just on rules but on fear. On people not pushing back. Once one person stands up, others start to remember they have rights too. Lauren confirmed what I already knew. The HOA had no authority over my property, and their attempts to fine or intimidate me were not only invalid but potentially illegal. She was drafting a county memo to clarify boundary jurisdiction for the entire Elmside area, and would be sending a formal advisory to the HOA board. Oh, and one more thing. Any future complaints from the HOA against me would have to go directly through her office. I almost offered her a lemonade on the spot. Later that afternoon, the real show began. Barb came marching down the path, holding the very memo Lauren had referenced. I don't know if it had been emailed or hand-delivered, but she was holding it like a weapon that had turned on her. She didn't step onto the property. She stood at the edge just outside the boundary marker I'd painted in white, because subtlety had long since become optional. "You've made your point," she said flatly. I smiled, leaned on the porch rail. "I thought the county made it for me." "You didn't have to drag the whole community into this," she snapped. That hit me wrong. I straightened. "You called the sheriff on me before you even asked my name. You sent letters, fines, threats. You had your board measuring my fence line. Don't act like I escalated anything." She bristled. Her jaw tensed. For a moment I thought she might launch into another lecture. But she didn't. She just nodded once, sharp and small, and walked away. Not a word since. But the fallout? Oh, it was delicious. Over the next few weeks I started hearing murmurs. At the post office. At the local diner. One HOA board member resigned for personal reasons. 2 others abstained from the next vote on new enforcement policies. And then came the kicker. At the next community board meeting, Barb was publicly challenged on her conduct. Someone stood up, an older man I'd never met, and asked, "How many of our fines actually hold up in court?" She stammered through a non-answer. Another neighbor asked about the failed 2006 vote, the one she'd clearly hoped no one would ever find. They had questions now. They had curiosity. Barb suddenly didn't have control, just a microphone and a room full of people who'd seen the emperor had no clothes. And me? I just kept working. Added a fire pit out back. Built a little dock. At sunset, I'd sit in a chair with a cold drink and watch the sky turn orange and violet over the lake. No fines. No interruptions. Just peace, the kind you earn. And every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of Barb walking by. Always at a distance. Never across the line. It's funny how something as simple as a boundary line can change everything, not just legally but emotionally. That white line at the edge of my gravel driveway. It became more than property. It became principle. And in the weeks that followed Barb's last failed power play, it was clear the neighborhood had drawn its own kind of line too. The tone shifted around Elmside shores. The fear was gone. Or at least cracked. One morning Rick from 2 doors down, same guy who once warned me to avoid Barb for a week, showed up with a 6-pack of craft beer and said, "Just figured you deserved the good stuff." We sat out on the deck and he told me how for years Barb had used neighborhood compliance as a hammer. Most people didn't argue because arguing meant becoming a target. "She went after my wife's birdbath last year," he said, shaking his head. "Said it was too ornamental." What the hell does that even mean? Apparently, I wasn't the only one who'd gotten the clipboard treatment. People started opening up. Little conversations at the market. Quiet nods from neighbors I hadn't even met. Even the town's Facebook group, which until recently might as well have been Barb's digital throne, began to shift. One resident posted a screenshot of my private property sign with the caption, "New local hero." I laughed when I saw it, but deep down I understood what it meant. It wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who'd been quietly bullied for years under the guise of community standards. And the best part? I didn't have to keep fighting. The county made it official. A resolution clarifying the HOA's jurisdiction was publicly filed. Barb could no longer pretend. She could still bark, but she couldn't bite outside the lines. And once she lost that power, once people realized her rules only worked if they allowed them to, it was over. Her influence didn't vanish overnight, but it faded, like fog in sunlight. At the next HOA election, she barely held on to her seat. By summer, she was just another name in the email chain, louder than most, sure, but with fewer people listening. Someone told me she still griped about my garden sculpture at meetings, but no one moved to vote on it. They'd learned their lesson. And me? I kept building. Not just on the office, but on the peace I'd fought for. I added a little reading nook by the window, a stone path down to the water. I started inviting friends to visit, even hosted a couple writing workshops for local authors. The place became what I'd always dreamed it would be: calm, quiet, real. Every now and then I'd get curious. I'd walk down the trail just past the property line and glance toward Barb's house. She still kept her lawn razor perfect. Her garden gnomes faced the same direction, lined up like soldiers. But something about the house felt still. Not peaceful. Just controlled. Like a place where joy had been wrapped in bubble wrap and filed under pending approval. I never crossed that line. Not out of fear, out of principle. I didn't need to go into her world. She had already tried to come into mine. And failed. It would have been easy to get bitter. To stew in resentment, replay the sheriff moment on a loop like a victory reel. But the truth is, I didn't win because I embarrassed her. I won because I didn't become her. I stayed grounded, patient, focused. I used her playbook and beat her at her own game, not to dominate but to reclaim what was already mine. That's what people forget about power. Real power isn't about control. It's about ownership. Of your space. Of your choices. Of your peace. So, when people ask me now, usually with a grin, "Hey, you're the guy with the HOA story, right?" I nod, smile and say, "Yeah, that was me." But I don't talk about the fight. I talk about the deck. The sunrise. The hawk that sometimes perches in the tree above my dock, watching the water like he owns it too. I tell them about the quiet. The kind that you earn. The kind that no one can take from you once you decide it's yours. And if I'm lucky, I get to end the story the way it really ended, not with drama but with a lesson. Sometimes the strongest stand you can take is staying still. Owning your space. Knowing that truth once planted doesn't need to shout to grow. And that's how a woman with a clipboard accidentally reminded me of the very thing she was trying to control. That real ownership isn't paperwork or rules or signatures. It's peace. And mine? It's lakefront.